The night had settled softly over the city, its lamps glowing like fragile stars scattered across winding streets, but beneath their golden light a young woman lingered in silence, her figure a shadow pressed against the cold stone of a forgotten corner. She looked as though she belonged to another world, clothes faded, hands clutching a small worn bag, eyes carrying the weight of stories never told. Yet there was a quiet grace about her, something almost luminous in the way she lifted her face toward the faint melody drifting from a cafe nearby, as though she could breathe in music itself and let it soothe the hunger gnawing within her chest. People passed without notice, rushing toward their destinations, but anyone who had paused long enough would have seen more than weariness. They would have seen the unspoken poetry of a soul still burning, the fragile strength of someone who refused to let despair erase the tenderness of her heart. She closed her eyes, listening to the faint notes that escaped into the evening. Each sound brushed gently against her memory, healing pieces of her spirit, like threads weaving broken glass into stained glass light. She had once known this world intimately, the sound of polished piano keys beneath her fingertips, her father's voice guiding her through the storms of complicated music, her mother's laughter echoing through wide rooms scented with home. Those days were gone, stolen too soon, leaving her to wander through hunger and loneliness. But in this moment, standing on the outside of life, the music reached her and whispered of promises not yet broken. And deep inside, a fragile seed of hope stirred. She pressed a trembling hand against the cafe's glass window, peering inside where warmth glowed like a dream. Families were gathered around tables, lovers leaned close in secret conversations, children laughed between mouthfuls of pasta and bread. At the corner, barely noticed, stood a black piano, its body dulled with dust, forgotten beneath coats and chatter. Her heart tightened, and for an instant she could almost feel her father's presence, whispering that music was more than notes, more than survival. It was healing itself, capable of lifting even the most weary heart back into light. The sight of that piano was like a door cracked open into the life she had lost. Inside her chest, fear and longing fought quietly. She could leave, continue her shadowed path, or she could step inside and risk the sting of rejection. She imagined herself walking in, the murmur of disapproval rising, yet also imagined the keys beneath her hands, the possibility of her soul speaking again. Courage flickered like a candle within her, and though the flame was fragile, she guarded it tenderly. She took a slow breath, her pulse quickening, and pushed open the heavy door. Warmth washed over her like an embrace, the scent of garlic and bread, the sound of silverware against porcelain, the laughter of strangers. For a heartbeat, she belonged nowhere and everywhere all at once. Eyes turned toward her instantly. The restaurant shimmered with light and polished glass, and she stood at its threshold like a misplaced note. Murmurs rippled across the room, expressions shifting from curiosity to disdain. She tightened her grip on her small bag, holding close the scattered pages of music she had carried like relics. The manager approached, his face sharp with practiced politeness, his tone clipped and cold. Yet instead of retreating, she drew a breath and found her voice, trembling but steady enough to say she only wished to play the piano. Laughter broke around her like shattering glass. They thought it absurd, a beggar asking for a stage. Yet she held her ground. The piano lid was lifted at last, revealing ivory keys stained with time. She lowered herself onto the bench, the world behind her dissolving into a hush of anticipation laced with cruelty. She touched the keys gently, her hands hovering, her breath catching as memory rose, her father's words, her own childlike laughter, the healing embrace of sound. Then she pressed the first note, and silence fell. A melody unfurled, soft as dawn, fragile yet alive, like a bird taking flight after a storm. At first, no one cared. Forks clinked, whispers passed, but she closed her eyes and let the music guide her. Slowly, like water finding its course, her song slipped into their hearts. The chatter quieted, faces lifted. One by one, the hardness melted, replaced by wonder. She poured into each phrase all the ache of lost years, but also tenderness, also hope. Every note was healing, gentle for the weary, tender for the broken, luminous for the forgotten. She did not play for survival alone. She played to remind the world and herself that beauty could rise from despair, that love still breathed even in ashes. By the time her final note faded into silence, the room was transformed. The same faces that had sneered now glistened with tears, and applause rose like thunder breaking a long drought. She opened her eyes to find strangers no longer laughing, but standing, clapping, touched. Her chest swelled with something almost unbearable, recognition, belonging, a whisper of destiny. And among the sea of faces, her gaze caught one that lingered longer than the rest, eyes steady, softened by something deeper than admiration. It was not yet love, not yet a promise, but it was the spark of a story just beginning. Somewhere in that applause, her heart began to heal. She realized that even the most broken paths could lead to light, that every note she played was more than survival. It was a gift. And though she did not yet know the shape of her future, she knew this was only the first step of something greater. She lifted her chin, tears sparkling on her lashes, and allowed herself to believe that love, like music, might return when least expected. If this moment has stirred something gentle in your heart, if the music of her journey has touched your soul, let it linger with you. Share your thoughts. Let your voice join this story. And if you feel the healing in these words, stay close. Your presence, your support, your quiet subscription to her unfolding journey means more than you can know. Every story grows stronger with love, and love, like music, is meant to be shared. The applause carried her forward into the next chapter, where shadows and light would continue to entwine. And already, beyond the echoes of clapping hands, destiny waited, patient and tender, ready to weave romance into the melody of her healing heart. She sat quietly after the applause faded, her hands still trembling from the intensity of the music, her heart beating with a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Around her, the room was changed, softened by what they had heard, yet she felt most of all the weight of her own silence, the sudden stillness that followed creation. The piano had carried her through hunger and loneliness, and in those moments she had given herself completely, revealing wounds and dreams in notes instead of words. Now, as she rose from the bench, she felt exposed, fragile, but also strangely alive, as though the music itself had wrapped around her like a healing cloak. People's voices broke the quiet again. Kind words, gentle touches, admiration spoken in murmurs. She was not used to kindness. It reached her like warmth after years of cold, and though her instinct was to retreat, something inside urged her to stay, to let herself be seen. She moved through the room carefully, shoulders slightly bent as if to make herself smaller, but everywhere hands reached toward her, eyes glowed with recognition. She caught phrases. Beautiful, extraordinary, thank you. Each word struck her deeply, not because of pride, but because they felt like proof that her father's voice, her father's teachings, had not disappeared into nothingness. She clutched her bag tighter, the worn pages inside it, holding every fragment of the past she had fought to preserve. For the first time in months, she felt her spirit soften. Hunger was still there, sharp and real, yet something else had begun to fill her emptiness. The realization that her music still mattered. When she was finally offered food, her hands shook as she accepted. A bowl of soup, a piece of bread, so simple, yet as she tasted it, tears threatened to spill. The flavors seemed to carry memories of home, of laughter in kitchens long gone, of warmth that had vanished too soon. She ate slowly, mindful of every bite, healing herself not only with nourishment, but with the kindness surrounding her. For months she had been invisible, and now, suddenly, she was seen. That truth itself was sustenance. From across the room she felt the weight of a steady gaze, not cold or curious, but deeply attentive. An older woman with grey hair and gentle eyes was watching her, not like the others who were still caught in astonishment, but with the recognition of someone who understood. Their eyes met for a moment, and in that silence a thread was tied, delicate but strong. It was not yet clear what it meant, but she felt it. Her life was beginning to shift. The woman rose, her presence calm, her steps certain, and when she spoke, it was with a softness that immediately eased the air around them. There was no pity in her tone, only respect. The girl listened, hesitated, then allowed herself to sit with her, to share fragments of a story she rarely told. She spoke of her father, of lessons at the piano, of the laughter and safety that had once been hers. She spoke of the accident that shattered everything, of her mother's sorrow and disappearance, of the streets that had become her only home. She did not expect compassion, but she found it, waiting in the woman's eyes like a quiet promise. The offer that followed was unexpected. Shelter, guidance, the chance to play again, not as a street girl, but as a student, as someone worthy of nurturing. Her breath caught. Trust had become a fragile thing in her world, but the sincerity in that voice, the steady hand reaching across the table, reminded her of healing she had long thought impossible. Could she accept? Could she believe that someone truly wanted nothing but to see her shine? Fear coiled within her, whispering of disappointment, of broken promises. Yet hope rose too, stubborn and luminous, whispering that perhaps destiny had brought her here for a reason. Night fell as she left the restaurant, the city quiet under a velvet sky. The money given for her breakfast felt strange in her pocket, heavy with possibility. She walked slowly through the streets, the rhythm of her steps softened by a warmth she had not known in months. Above her, the stars shimmered faintly, and she thought of her father, of his voice calling music the most powerful form of healing. Perhaps he was still guiding her. Perhaps this was his way of reminding her that the world still held open doors. Her heart raced as she unfolded the napkin with the address. Tomorrow would bring a choice. She could remain hidden, clinging to survival in the shadows, or she could step toward the unknown, risking trust, risking disappointment, for the chance of a future where her music could live again. She pressed the napkin close, as if it were more than paper, as if it were a key. Her breath misted in the cool night air, and she whispered to herself that she would be brave. She would go. The streets seemed less hostile that evening, softened by the echo of applause still ringing in her ears. She paused by a darkened shop window and saw her reflection, worn clothes, tired eyes, but behind them a light she had not seen before. It was faint, but it was hers, and it carried her forward. She smiled, barely, but it was real, and it was enough to remind her that every ending carried the seed of a beginning. When dawn came, it would be time to step into that beginning. And though uncertainty waited, so too did healing, so too did love that she had not yet glimpsed, waiting like music between unplayed notes. Morning broke with the kind of fragile light that felt like a promise. She awoke from restless dreams, the sound of rain dripping against the window of the shelter where she had found a corner to rest. For a moment she remained still, listening to the rhythm, letting it calm the restless storm inside her. The napkin with the address lay folded beside her, soft from being held too tightly through the night. She touched it with reverence, as though it were a talisman, both delicate and strong, guiding her towards something unknown but necessary. Hunger stirred, but more than that, anticipation trembled in her chest. Today would not be like other days. Today was the day she would step toward a doorway that might lead her back to the life her father had believed she was born for. She walked the streets slowly, the city carrying its usual pulse of hurried footsteps and distant voices. Yet for her, each step felt sacred. She bought a simple breakfast with the money she had been given, the bread soft and warm, the tea fragrant and sweet. She ate with care, savoring each bite, as though she were preparing herself not just in body, but in spirit. Nourishment was no longer just survival, it was healing, a ritual of strength for the unknown path ahead. The neighborhood shifted as she moved closer to the address. Narrow alleys gave way to wide streets lined with trees, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Houses rose behind iron gates, their gardens blooming even in early spring. She slowed, hesitant, feeling out of place, but the napkin in her hand urged her forward. At last she stood before a house with tall windows and ivy climbing its walls, a place that looked alive with history and warmth. She lingered at the gate, her heart racing. She thought of turning back, of returning to the familiar safety of invisibility, yet something greater called to her, the same force that had led her to the piano, that had carried her through applause, that whispered now, "Be brave." The door opened before she could summon the courage to knock. The older woman's face appeared, lined with years, yet softened by kindness. Her eyes lit up with quiet joy at the sight of her. No questions, no hesitation, only welcome. The threshold felt sacred as she crossed it, her steps uncertain but steady. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and books, the warmth of a lived-in home. Sunlight spilled across the hallway, falling on framed photographs and shelves filled with sheet music. She clutched her bag tightly, but for the first time in months she did not feel like an intruder. She felt as though the house itself whispered acceptance. The woman led her to a room prepared with care. Clean sheets on a bed, a dresser, curtains pulled back to reveal a garden beyond the window. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to belong in a room. Her throat tightened, and though words trembled on her lips, she could not speak. Gratitude filled her like light, spilling into the cracks of her weary spirit. The woman touched her hand gently, offering nothing but reassurance, and left her to settle in. Alone, she sank onto the bed and pressed her face into the softness. Tears came, not from despair, but from the healing release of being safe, if only for a while. Later, she followed the woman into another room, and there it was, the grand piano, its surface gleaming, its presence commanding yet inviting. She froze at the threshold, afraid to step closer, afraid it might vanish if she touched it. The woman smiled, motioned her forward, and soon she sat at the bench, her hands trembling above the keys. She had imagined this moment in dreams, had felt it in empty nights when music only lived in her memory. Now it was here. She pressed a single note, pure and resonant, filling the room with a sound that seemed to cleanse the air. Her breath caught. Another note, then another, until the melody flowed like a river, long dammed, finally breaking free. The woman listened quietly, her eyes glistening. She knew she was witnessing not just talent, but rebirth. The girl played as though her very soul was pouring through her fingertips, fragile yet fierce, broken yet unyielding. Each phrase carried memory, loss, love, and hope, entwined in healing threads of sound. When at last the music faded, silence lingered heavy and holy. The woman spoke softly, words of encouragement, of recognition, of possibility. For the girl it was like being seen for the first time, not as a shadow, not as a beggar, but as an artist, as someone with a gift worthy of nurture. Days began to pass differently. She awoke to sunlight instead of cold stone. She practiced each morning, her fingers regaining strength, her heart discovering courage again. The woman guided her gently, never forcing, only shaping, reminding her that music was not just skill, but expression, healing, truth. Evenings were filled with shared meals, with laughter that felt unfamiliar yet comforting. Slowly, the walls inside her began to soften. Trust returned like the first green shoots after winter. But along with healing came fear. The woman spoke of conservatories, of auditions, of places where her gift could shine again. The girl listened, her heart fluttering between hope and dread. Could she stand in front of judges and risk rejection again? Could she prove to the world that she was more than the streets had made her? The thought of failure pressed heavily, yet behind it burned the memory of applause, the echo of a room transformed by her playing. Perhaps she had not been imagining it. Perhaps she truly carried something rare within her. One evening, she sat at the piano long after the woman had gone to rest. The house was quiet, the garden outside bathed in moonlight. She began to play not from sheet music, but from her own heart. Notes unfolded, fragile and raw, weaving sorrow with tenderness, longing with hope. She played for her father, for her mother, for the lost years. She played for the girl who had walked into the restaurant asking for food, but truly asking for belonging. And in that moment she realized she was no longer only surviving. She was beginning to live again. The final note lingered, soft and luminous, as though blessing the room with peace. She pressed her hand over her heart, breathing deeply, letting the healing warmth settle within her. Tomorrow would bring challenges, tests she could not yet imagine, but tonight she allowed herself to believe. She had found a doorway into light, and she would not let fear close it again. The moonlight stretched across the keys like silver threads, and as she closed her eyes, she felt as though destiny itself was guiding her hands, carrying her gently toward the next chapter of her story, where love, healing, and music would intertwine into something greater than she had ever dared to dream. Rain gave way to a pale blue morning, and with it came the quiet hum of a house that had begun to remember laughter. She woke before the alarm, the softness of the sheets still a small miracle against her skin. Birds conversed in the garden with an earnestness that felt like prayer. She lay listening, steadying her breath, letting the simple rhythm of morning settle in her bones. The piano waited downstairs, not like a possession, but like a companion, and she could feel the faint tug of it, a healing pull guiding her feet to the floor, to the doorway, to the days that were beginning to belong to her. In the kitchen, a kettle sang. The older woman smiled over the rim of her cup, a warmth in her eyes that asked for nothing and gave everything. They spoke of nothing heavy, how the jasmine by the porch had surprised the gardener with late blossoms, how a stray cat had adopted the back steps, how the sky, on certain afternoons, coloured itself the same deep blue as the velvet lining of a violin case. They did not say the word audition yet, though it hovered, gentle and inevitable, like a cloud that meant rain, but not the hard kind, just the soft, cleansing kind. When breakfast was over, she drifted to the music room. The first notes of practice were always shy. Her fingers, though growing stronger each day, still asked her permission before flying. She gave it by degrees, reminding them how to trust. Scales bloomed into patterns, patterns ripened into phrases. Phrases, once strung together, became a path back to the self she had almost lost. Some days the music felt like confession, on others it was a blessing spoken over old wounds. The older woman listened from the doorway, a quiet witness who knew when to offer a word and when to let silence do the work. Together they tended the hours like a garden. She did not expect the knock. It came mid-morning, neither urgent nor timid, just a clear sound like a metronome calling attention. The older woman went to answer, and a moment later returned with a man she had seen once before, if not his face, then his presence, the way he looked at music as though it had a pulse only he could hear. He stepped into the room, careful, as if the air itself might bruise. His hair was dishevelled in a way that suggested he had run a little. His coat carried the faint damp of a recent rain. He held a cello case. "I'm sorry to arrive unannounced," he said softly. "I was at the restaurant that night. I heard her play." Something in her chest folded and unfolded again. She hadn't imagined it then. The steady gaze that had caught hers at the end of the applause, the sense of being seen without being crowded. The older woman introduced them, names crossing the room and settling where they belonged. He was called Gabriel, the kind of name that sounded like a first breath. When he spoke again, he directed it to the older woman, but his eyes returned to the piano as though there were a magnet inside the instrument and he was made of fillings. "If I'm intruding, I'll go," he said. "But I thought, if she's preparing for something, perhaps a companion voice might help. Sometimes a line becomes truer when it listens to another line." The older woman considered and then smiled. "Music is a conversation, not a corridor. Stay." He opened the cello case with the quiet reverence of someone returning a relic to light. The instrument was dark and luminous, as if made of nighttime and honey. He tuned quickly, his ear finding home with the ease of somebody who has lived a long time inside sound. She slid to the edge of the piano bench to make room in the air between them. They did not choose a piece immediately. Instead, they played the oldest game two musicians know. She offered a small phrase, an unsure fragment, like a child holding out a shell. He answered on a single string, low and tender, echoing her idea, polishing it, returning it warmed by his breath. Her hands responded, building a bridge to meet his line. The room changed temperature. Time, which had been polite, stepped back and let them pass. They played not to impress, not to display, but to hear one another breathe. Where her right hand lifted into light, his bow carried dusk. Where her left hand rooted, his resonance lifted roots and held them to the window. She found herself not alone inside the music anymore, the safe solitude she had learned on the street replaced by something gentler. Companionship, balance, a healing counterpoint that did not swallow her voice, but made it sing clearer. When they stopped, the silence felt like velvet. Her pulse sounded in her ear as if to say, "Remember this." He rested the cello against his knee and met her eyes as though they were on the far side of a river and had finally found a place shallow enough to cross. "You play as if you remember," he said. "Not just notes, places, people." She could have deflected, could have made light of it, but the room had grown into a place where truth could live. "I don't know how to play any other way," she said. "If I stop telling the truth, my hands forget how to speak." He nodded like someone in church. After that morning, he began to appear regularly, not imposing a schedule, only arriving when invited, always leaving the door open to her quiet. He never pressed for stories, yet their afternoons filled with them all the same. Between scales and etudes, laughter found them, low and surprised, the kind that grows where kindness has made soil. He told her about the first time he carried his cello on a bus and how a small boy asked if it was a treasure chest. She told him that, to her, pianos had always looked like ships. "They're how people cross," she said, and he understood. They worked through repertoire like travelers tracing a map with their fingers, not rushing past cities, but stopping to taste their bread. Bach became a refuge, his voices interlacing like hands in the dark, and they discovered that when she brought a phrase up to the light, he could hold its shadow with a warmth that made the whole thing glow. Chopin let them be tender. Debussy taught them how to breathe. A simple folk melody, hummed by the older woman while she watered the roses, became an encore they never announced and always returned to, as if to remind themselves that greatness often enters through a humble door. When they tired, they rested without shame. She learned to close the fallboard and lean her forehead against its cool wood, to let fatigue be simply fatigue and not a moral failing. He put the cello away as one would tuck a child into bed. Tea steamed. The older woman, who had lived long enough to understand that the world is always asking for performance, made the house a sanctuary where nothing had to be earned. Healing did its slow, necessary work in the absence of hurry. If the question of the conservatory crept back in, it did so like a whisper in a friendly room. The older woman would sit after dinner with a stack of letters, her glasses sliding down her nose, reading responses from colleagues who had called her brave and persistent and sometimes worse, responses that revealed the world's reflex to judge a life from a single page. There were advocates, teachers who believed in talent over pedigree, but there were also gatekeepers who wore caution like virtue. One evening, a formal envelope arrived on heavy paper, a crest pressed into its skin. The letter inside was worded with the kind of restraint that has no place in music. It explained a special opportunity and a rigorous provisional pathway, and beneath its gentility lay the chilled certainty of a test no one expected her to pass. The older woman read it aloud and then, without comment, folded it carefully as though to keep its cold from touching the furniture. "They want you to leap through a hoop on fire," Gabriel said when the older woman left the room to compose herself. "And they'll still call it a ring." She took a long breath. The room smelled faintly of tea and lemon oil. "I don't mind leaping," she said. "I just want it to be towards something real." He studied her face, that quiet steadiness he carried turning incandescent. "Then make it real," he said. "Let them come to your truth, or make your truth so bright they can't pretend not to see." In the days that followed, their work intensified, but not in the old, harsh way. It was not punishment, it was preparation, warm and exact, like a hearth built brick by careful brick. They constructed a routine that respected the body: morning practice, midday rest, afternoon duets, evening walks through the garden, where they spoke of anything but music until music missed them and called them back. She wrote small phrases in a notebook the older woman had given her, seed ideas that might grow into pieces of her own. Sometimes they did, climbing the staff like vines toward light. In the garden, spring thickened into a persuasion of greens. Gabriel pointed out the way light pooled in the cups of leaves after rain. She showed him how the wind taught the roses to bow without breaking. They spoke of ordinary things and found their tenderness in them. He told her his sister had once been sick for a long time, and that the cello was the only language he had for the fear that made a thief of sleep. She told him about a lullaby her father used to play, and how the final chord always made her believe goodbyes were not permanent. Their memories became a second repertoire. One late afternoon, a storm rolled in without ceremony. The house darkened, as if tucking itself under a blanket. They lit lamps. Thunder wrote its own crescendos. She suggested playing by heart, no scores, letting the storm be their metronome. The first time she missed a note, she winced and lifted her hands. Gabriel kept going, not to shame her, but to remind her the river was still flowing. She slipped back in at the next measure, as if she had never left. Later, when the rain eased, when the room smelled sharp and clean, he said, "You don't disappear when you falter. You reappear." He ought to have known what his words would do, how they would lodge under her ribs and glow there. She turned away, not to hide, but to absorb. A draught crept through the window and lifted the hair at the nape of her neck. She tucked it behind her ear with the unself-conscious intimacy of someone who has forgotten she is being watched. He looked away then too, giving privacy to a moment that already belonged to them both. The older woman began inviting a small circle of friends to listen on Sunday afternoons. Not patrons or judges, musicians who had given their lives to phrases and still believed in mercy. They arrived with pastries and stories, stood at the back with arms crossed for the first piece, then slowly, inevitably, unfolded in their chairs. After the last note, feedback came not as verdict, but as companionship. A suggestion about a fingering that might free a wrist, a question about a cadence that wanted a breath. A reminder that silence inside a phrase is not emptiness, but a promise. Each comment, even the sharp ones, bore the fragrance of care. She slept hard on Sunday nights, asleep without armor. News of the restaurant performance had travelled in ways none of them expected. A local paper printed a column by a critic who wrote about it as if he had been there. "A girl played a piano with a hunger greater than hunger," he wrote, "and we discovered we were the ones starving." The line embarrassed her and steadied her in equal measure. She was not a headline, but if the headline opened a door, she would walk through and leave it open behind her. The next letter from the conservatory arrived on a bright morning. It was not heavy like the first. It did not try to intimidate with crest and paper. It was concise, almost warm. They would hear her, it said. There would be terms. They did not apologize for them. The older woman placed the letter on the piano as one might set a glass of water on a table. Useful, not decorative, an object to be drank and then set aside. "We accept," she said simply, and in the way her voice held, calm and sure, was the difference between a person being granted permission and a person walking into what is already hers. Preparation, acquired specificity, outlines of the days, exposure to repertoire they might request, mock auditions in the music room where the older woman sat at the back with a pencil and a heart that could hear every tremble. Gabriel rehearsed entering and leaving the stage with her, a small choreography that carried larger meanings. They practiced bowing not as apology, but as gratitude. In the evenings, after dinner, she and Gabriel would step into the garden to let their minds loosen. Sometimes they did not speak at all. The silence between them was not absence, but a presence that soothed, healing in its gentleness, like hands folded, like a forehead leaned against a window to feel the cool. The night before the first audition, they gathered in the parlour as if it were a hearth. No one made speeches. The older woman produced a tin of cookies. Gabriel poured tea. She laughed when the kettle protested, a bright thread of sound that startled her by its ease. They played not music, but a card game the older woman insisted was excellent for nerves because it required attention without consequence. When she lost a hand, she feigned outrage so extravagantly that the older woman nearly spit her tea. Gabriel watched the scene like someone who had walked a long way in the dark and finally turned a corner into lamplight. In her room, she laid out her dress with care, smoothing fabric as if smoothing the water of an unsettled pond. She studied her reflection not to judge, but to recognize. She saw what remained, eyes that had learned how to say yes to light, and what had returned, softness at the corners of her mouth. On the chair sat the worn bag that carried her father's pages. Next to it, the notebook of her own phrases. She rested a palm on each, blessing them not as relics, but as instruments of a future she was building measure by measure. Sleep came in fragments, but without fear. She dreamed not of forgetting notes, not of closed doors, but of a hall where the back row leaned forward because something true had reached them. She woke before dawn, heart steady, the world outside a hush that felt sacred. Downstairs, the house waited like a friend who rises early to walk beside you. She pressed her hand to the piano surface, whispering a thank you that no one needed to hear but the wood. They left with time to spare. The city had not yet chosen a mood. The conservatory rose from the street with the kind of elegance that often forgets humility. She climbed the steps without measuring their height. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of old polish and ambition. Students passed with cases and coffee and eyes fixed on some imagined future. She did not envy them. She carried her own imagined future, and it felt, to her, not like a far city, but like the next room. Gabriel stopped beside a window where the light was kind. He adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. The gesture was nothing, and it unravelled her just enough to let her breathe. The older woman, who had decided to wait outside the audition door like a quiet citadel, pressed a hand to her shoulder. "Play," she said, "as if the room belongs to the person you were when you first knew music was a language." The blessing lifted something that had been heavy but unnamed. When she stood in the wings, waiting for her name, she did not rehearse the opening measure. She rehearsed belonging. She pictured the first key like a hand waiting to be held. She pictured Gabriel's bow drawing its line through the air, even though he would not play beside her in the hall. She pictured the older woman at a kitchen table, glasses low, reading a letter aloud and folding it gently, refusing to let the cold in. They called her. The door opened. She stepped through. The piano was as grand pianos always are under lights, but it looked to her not like a monument, more like a threshold. She bowed with gratitude, not apology, and sat. Outside, down the corridor, Gabriel leaned his back against the wall and closed his eyes. In the garden at home, the roses held their breath against the wind as if the whole house were listening. The older woman folded her hands and in the quiet that followed became a harbour. She placed her fingers. The first note rose, steady and clear, not a plea, but a greeting. It floated toward the judges and then beyond them, to the back row, to the walls, to the ceiling that had heard everything and still made room for this. In that tone lived the street and the shelter and the night of applause and the kitchen morning and the afternoons of duet and the storm and the card game and the dress laid out like a promise. The sound did its soft, radiant work, healing as it travelled, reminding the room that technique is a body, but truth is a pulse. Measures opened and became corridors, and she walked them unafraid. Where once her hands had hurried, they now lingered long enough to let beauty arrive. Where once she had braced, she now released. She did not perform against the judge's expectation. She performed toward the people who had carried her here, and toward the girl she had been when hunger felt like a wall. She felt that wall grow a door. At the end, she did not look up immediately. She listened for silence to close its hand around the last note, tender, like a mother smoothing a child's hair. When she lifted her head, there was no thunder, no gasp, just a quiet that felt honest. One judge wrote carefully, another's mouth softened. The center pair exchanged a look that did not need translation. "Thank you," someone said. She rose, bowed, and turned. The door clicked softly behind her. In the corridor, Gabriel was already standing straighter than he had a moment before, as if a bell only he could hear had rung. The older woman's eyes glistened, and in them she saw not relief but recognition. She had not asked permission to belong. She had brought her belonging with her, like a breath. They did not ask, "How did it go?" They did not rush to fill the air with analysis. They walked toward the light by the big front window where the city was putting on its noon brightness. She reached for Gabriel's hand without thinking and found it waiting, steady, in her own. The older woman smiled as if a secret had at last remembered its name. Outside, the day had turned tender and bright, the kind of weather that makes leaves look new, even in late spring. They stepped into it, not triumphant, not humbled, simply aligned. And while the future still held its conditions and terms, while letters would still arrive with their stiff paper and careful words, something inside her had shifted in a way no verdict could undo. She had given the room her truth, and her truth had answered her back. On the walk home, the wind smelled of rain that might come later, and of sunlight that intended to stay. The older woman spoke of soup, of bread that would be warm by the time they reached the kitchen. Gabriel promised to tune his A string before evening, as though that, too, were a pledge to keep faith with what was beginning. She listened to them, and for the first time in a long time, felt her life fitting her like a dress sewn for her body alone. There would be another day, another test, and then another. But for now, it was enough to feel the world expand a little. Enough to know that love was already threading itself between the beats of her music, quiet as breath, steady as a pulse, waiting to be named fully when the time was right. And as the house welcomed them back and the afternoon unrolled like a ribbon of calm, she understood that the next part of her journey would not be travelled alone. The second day arrived with a sky so clear it felt polished. She woke to the soft sound of the garden being watered, the older woman humming somewhere near the roses, and an early note of the cello from down the hall, a single A, quiet as a held breath. Inside that steadiness, her nerves thinned and softened like sugar in tea. She washed, dressed, pressed her palms together as if in prayer, then went downstairs to the piano, where the polished lid reflected her face in a way that made her both stranger and known. The conservatory's corridor had a different scent that morning. Chalk dust and citrus polish, pages shuffling, chairs being gently aligned. She sat again at the grand and felt the small miracle of familiarity in an unfamiliar place. The second panel looked different too. One judge replaced, another added, the centre chair the same. A man with a measured gaze who regarded her as a problem to be solved rather than a person walking into light. She bowed, sat, and let her thumb find the seam at the edge of the bench, an anchor she had started to trust. When she began, she did not rush the opening. Notes unfurled with the clean articulation of truth spoken without apology. She had learned in the music room at home, and in the dark nights before that clarity is an act of tenderness. It allows sound to be exactly itself. Halfway through the piece, a measure asked for everything: breath, courage, patience. Instead of pushing, she released. The phrase rounded its corner like a river gliding past a bend. Somewhere in the hall, a throat was cleared, a pencil paused, a hush gathered itself a little closer. She finished in a softness that made the final resonance feel like a hand settling on a shoulder. This time a judge smiled with his eyes, before remembering he was not supposed to. They left by the side door to avoid the throng of eager students and their evolving myths. On the steps, sunlight sharpened the gold in Gabriel's hair. He did not ask, "How did it go?" He handed her a wrapped lemon cookie and said, "Sugar for the muscles that aren't muscles." She laughed and bit, the glaze sweet and tart enough to remind her there were joys as small as a crumb and as large as a hall listening with its whole body. The third day made its entrance without preamble. The letter from the panel specified a repertoire choice that lifted eyebrows even among the older woman's friends, a piece notorious for swallowing hands whole. She pressed her palms on the closed lid and felt the cool. "A door is still a door," she whispered. Gabriel set a practice clock on the music rack and wound it with the care a father might tie a child's scarf. "Let time be a companion, not a judge," he said, and she nodded, trusting the way his voice could make a room inhale and exhale at the right pace. They broke the day into pieces, segments marked by tea, by the sound of the kettle's whistle, by walks through the garden with steps counted not as points, but as breaths. The older woman enforced rest the way a good conductor enforces silence, firmly and with love. "Silence is music pregnant with music," she said, pushing a bowl of lentil soup across the table. "Eat the quiet. Your hands will thank you." Even so, by evening, the brickwork of the piece felt only half laid. Doubt came, as doubt does in ordinary clothing. It sat at the end of the bench and made lists. She closed the fall board, pressed her forehead against the varnish, and let her breath count back from 10. She did not banish doubt. She set it down on the rug and covered it with a blanket of small kindnesses: water, a walk, 5 minutes of staring at Gabriel's bow as it rested, curved and patient, in its case. When she returned, the missing measures had loosened something inside their own insistence. She played again, slower, clearer, kinder. Notes that had been iron found a way to be willow. On stage the next afternoon, the notorious run arrived as if it hadn't sharpened its teeth. She did not fight it. She made room. The notes cascaded like glass beads poured into a steady hand. None spilled. When the final cadence sank into the floorboards and drifted up into the ceiling's honeycomb, a judge, one of the new ones, coughed to cover the sound his mouth had made. No one wrote anything for a few heartbeats. In that space, she heard her father's long-ago laugh and the wind in the roses and the secret the older woman kept under her tongue, that Grace often arrives wearing work clothes. Between the third and the fourth day, the world decided to be ordinary. The washing machine jostled itself into a loud corner and had to be persuaded back. A bee chased Gabriel across the lawn, and the older woman's amusement turned into an anecdote that would, inevitably, appear at exactly the wrong dinner some day and make him blush. Supper was roasted carrots, bread still singing faintly from the oven, butter soft as a cloud. They ate in companionable near silence, the kind that polishes the silver of the soul without anyone making a fuss about it. Later, intent on a short walk, she opened the front door and saw him at the gate, Marcus Sterling, the centre chair, his posture straight and his jaw set as though he had been born to hold verdicts in his hands. Gabriel was with him. They stood too close to be strangers, too far to be friends. Something cold traced the hinge of her shoulder. She stood very still, the lamplight sculpting a thin line across the threshold at her feet. "Mr. Sterling wanted directions," Gabriel said lightly when he saw her, and it was only almost true. Sterling's gaze moved from the cello case to the house and back to her, measuring. "We all admire persistence," he said, as if announcing a found fact. "But admiration is not admission." There was a pause in which he could have left. He didn't. Be careful not to confuse applause with mastery. Then he gave the smallest nod to the older woman, courtesy pressed into a shape, and walked away with the efficient strides of a man who always knows what time it is. The door closed softly, but not before the air had chilled. The silence inside felt different, less velvet than paper thin. She wanted to ask Gabriel why he had been speaking with Sterling. She also didn't want to know. Both truths sat in her mouth, neither willing to be swallowed. He looked stricken, and then careful, the way a person looks when he is trying to be several kinds of honest at once. "He found me on the steps," he began, "and said he remembered my recital from years ago, and then "It's all right," she said, and meant it enough to make it true for the moment. They left the unasked questions on the hall table with the keys and the day's mail. Later, alone with the piano, she laid her palm on middle C and waited for her pulse to knock against the wood. When it did, slower than she expected and steadier than she feared, she let her fingers fall into a simple progression she had loved since childhood. The house exhaled. The night softened. She did not know what Gabriel had promised or refused, only that he would arrive stubbornly early in the morning and that his presence would be a language she could trust. The knowledge settled her like a shawl. Day 4 demanded both sanctuary and storm. The panel requested a work that required her to be thunder and rain at once, weight without force, speed without hurry, fire that could warm without burning the house. She and Gabriel began the morning with Bach, letting clarity sweep the room of cobwebs, and then moved into the piece's labyrinth with a lantern made of rhythm. They didn't talk about Sterling. There would be time to let disappointment or anger do their tidying later. For now, purpose took the chair at the table and poured the tea. At noon, the older woman gathered them in the kitchen and, in an act of quiet, holy rebellion, insisted on pie before the main course. "Sweetness first," she said, cutting neat triangles and setting them on plates like gifts. "We'll be sensible after." Warm cherries bled into vanilla. The ordinary sanctified the difficult. When they returned to the music room, the hard measures were still hard, but they were no longer sharp. They had lost the edge that turns work into punishment. She ran the left-hand octaves and discovered her wrists could be both strong and loose, like swans that remember water is a soft strength. The hall on the 4th afternoon was almost full. Word had travelled the way rumours always sprint past facts. Students stood at the back, with their eyes bright and their mouths working silently through someone else's fingering choices. She tuned herself to the room the way a singer tunes to a space. The opening came out like a door thrown wide to a field, a sweep of air across the faces, a sensation of light moving. The passage that had frightened her turned into a flight, not a scramble, an actual lift, her bones remembering what birds know. Afterward, a hand stopped her in the corridor, a woman with hair gone silver, cheekbones like kindness, a former juror from a far-off city. "You move like you trust the ground," she said. "That's the difference between playing and speaking." The compliment slipped into her pocket. Warm, alive, nothing she needed to brandish, enough to hold when courage got thirsty. That evening they allowed themselves a walk to the river. The city lights braided themselves into the slow water. Gabriel's shoulder brushed hers once, twice. She didn't step away. "He's not wrong, you know," he said finally, his voice threadbare with honesty rather than regret. "Applause isn't mastery." She smiled, because she felt safe enough to grin. "And yet, isn't it sweet when mastery earns applause?" He laughed, turned fully toward her, and for a moment the river forgot to move. He didn't kiss her. Neither of them would borrow toward something as sacred as that. But the air between them altered irrevocably, like two notes learning they were written to be harmony. Night carried them home softly. The older woman had left the porch light on, one of those small gestures that can redeem an entire year. In her room, she placed the worn bag with her father's pages on the chair and the notebook of her own phrases beside it. She lay down and did not scold her mind for running scenes of the day across the dark. When sleep came, it brought the sound of Gabriel's bow riding a whisper of air and the older woman's firm, tender voice blessing her wrists, her breath, her courage. The final day did not arrive like a drum roll. It came the way a letter comes after weeks of waiting. Simply there, addressed plainly, the rest of the world continuing with its errands. The panel had offered her a choice for the closing performance, their repertoire or her own. She stood at the piano in the morning light and felt the weight and mercy in that. A choice can be a freedom or a trap. She chose the narrow path, the one that required a different kind of strength, the one her father would have named without looking at the clock. "Your piece?" Gabriel asked, though he didn't need to. "My letter," she said. They did not rehearse it to death. They let it remain a living thing. She played it once in the music room, not to perfect it, but to remind the house how it felt to be a vessel for something unguarded. The older woman cried, the dignified sort of crying that understands gratitude is assault. "Leave the edges where they are," she said, wiping under one eye. "They're the map of where you've walked." On the way to the hall, rain threatened and then changed its mind. The pavement shone as if someone had polished the city. The concierge at the front desk lifted his chin in an almost smile. Somewhere above them, in the third-floor window, where the leaves of a plant had pressed themselves against the glass, was a world with dishes in the sink and a radio murmuring. A world that had no idea how a single sound would pluck a string that would not stop trembling for years. She stood in the wings and did not tremble. She kept her hands warm by holding them together lightly, palm to palm, as if she were warming a small bird she intended to release. The door opened. She walked to the bench. The judges arranged their mouths into neutrality. The audience rustled, then stilled as rest finds a chair. When she spoke the title, the words balanced in the air like a lantern. She did not hurry the silence that followed. And then she began, not because the clock asked it, but because her heart did. The first notes moved like footsteps remembering a house by scent alone. The melody did not demand, it invited. Midway, the anger came lit, honest and clean. She did not apologize for it. She let it burn warm enough to cauterize, not scorch. The final section did not pretend the world was healed. It offered the small bravery of continuing anyway. She felt, rather than saw, the room stand closer to itself. In the last chord, she heard chairs realign their intentions. When the resonance finally decided it had said enough and bowed out of the rafters, there was a stillness that belonged to no one and to everyone at once, the kind of quiet in which the body tells the truth to itself. She lifted her hands from the keys and held the ending like a cup. Nothing moved for a breath, and then the world remembered how hands met. Voices rose. She did not search the judges for approval because the answer she needed had already arrived and set itself down in her chest. She stood and bowed, gratitude an easy weight between her ribs. At the back of the hall, a figure who had loved her in a time before hunger slipped a hand over her mouth. The older woman's fingers were laced together as if holding a bird that had finally landed. Gabriel did not clap at first. He breathed. Then he did clap, and the sound he made was unlike the others because it carried a private music. The memory of duets, of storms, of pie before soup, of a porch light left on. In the corridor afterward, where the lights always buzzed as if nervous, they did not reach for words that would only make an elegant mess. He pressed his forehead gently to hers for the tiniest coin of time, offering rest the way some men offer roses. The older woman set a hand at the base of her spine, reminding her body that there was a place behind it that could hold the weight. Sterling stood at the far end, his face unreadable. He approached and stopped half a meter away, as if the floor between them had been asked to hold something important. "Miss Chen," he said, and the edges of her name were softer in his mouth than they had been. "Thank you for the clarity." It was not a verdict, it was not absolution, it was a door that could open, and that was enough. They stepped into a bright day that had decided to forgive the clouds. The streets smelled like wet stone and bakery sugar. Children ran past carrying paper boats. She watched them and felt her whole life lean forward into a future that was not a cliff, but a path. There would be letters, there would be results, terms, the catalogue of the practical, and there would also be a kitchen table with a tin of cookies, a music room that kept the imprint of her hands, a cello case that opened like a secret, a garden that refused to learn despair. All of it, braided. They turned toward home. Gabriel carried nothing in his hands and everything in his face. The older woman walked a step behind, as if guarding the rear of a small procession, carrying something sacred through a city that was learning to watch with kindness. The air felt gentle against her cheeks, a healing breeze that did not announce itself with trumpets. Inside, the place where fear used to practice had fallen silent. In its place was a wide, warm yes, ready to answer whatever came next, ready to write the next movement with the same patient ink. Truth, tenderness, light. The letter arrived on a morning so bright the garden seemed made of glass. She found it tucked beneath the brass slot of the front door, heavy paper with a crest she recognized, her name written in that measured hand she had started to see in her sleep. The older woman lifted it gently, as if it contained breath rather than ink, and waited for her to come closer. They did not open it immediately. They placed it on the kitchen table beside the teapot, between a bowl of apricots and the small jar of honey Gabriel had brought from a farmer with a smile like a sunbeam. The house breathed around them. Floorboards creaked softly. The clock cleared its throat. Birds tapped at the window as if eager to be included in whatever this was. "Tea first," the older woman said, and the decision held the room in a tender ritual. The kettle began to murmur, steam blossomed, the teaspoon sang against porcelain. The letter waited with the patience of an old tree. They poured, shared apricots, and allowed sweetness to soften the edges of fear. At last, she slid a finger beneath the seal and lifted it. She read in silence, her eyes moving carefully, line by cautious line. The older woman's hand came to rest on her forearm, steady as a lighthouse, and Gabriel, who had arrived without noise and stood leaning in the doorway with his cello case kissed by dust and light, watched her face as if it were a map of weather he needed to learn. When she finished, she exhaled, but not the way one exhales after bracing for hurt. It sounded instead like someone stepping into warm water. She smiled, the kind of small, unstoppable smile that begins in the eyes and gradually finds the mouth. "They said yes," she whispered. "They said yes to all of it. Audition passed. Scholarship confirmed, room and board, a mentor assigned." Her voice trembled, then widened like light through leaves. "There are still rules, a schedule, recitals, evaluations. But, yes." The older woman pressed her hand tighter and then let it go, only to pull her into an embrace that smelled like lavender and lemon oil. "They said yes to what has always been true," she murmured into her hair. Gabriel did not move at first. He lowered his head, and when he lifted it, his eyes were bright with a joy that did not try to hide. He didn't rush forward. He stayed in the doorway for a heartbeat longer, as if anchoring the moment, and then crossed the kitchen slowly, as though walking through a soft rain, and set the cello down like a guest who had been travelling too long. He wrapped his arms around both of them, and they stood in the centre of the room like three stones in a river that had finally chosen a direction. It would have been easy to believe that the day had nothing but music in it, and for a while that felt true. They moved through small celebrations. The older woman cut slices of a cake she had baked the night before, as if she had known. Gabriel fetched 3 cups, then 4, because he said joy deserved company, and poured coffee that smelled like curiosity. They laughed the way people laugh when their ribs remember what it means to expand. Neighbors appeared with questions disguised as congratulations. A man from the local paper called, and she said, very quietly, "Not yet. Let me have today." Afternoon shifted, and the world remembered its errands. Paperwork, forms, signatures, a visit to the conservatory office that smelled of ink and new carpet, a photograph taken against a pale backdrop that turned her into a student in the eyes of a system that hadn't wanted to see her. It was bureaucratic and beautiful at once. Every box ticked felt like a note in a chord that had waited too long to be voiced. Then, just before evening braided itself into the corners, the first shadow stepped lightly across the threshold. Sterling's name appeared on a folded document with a designation beside it. Faculty Mentor. The word was neutral ink, but it changed the temperature of the page. She traced the letters as one might trace a scar. A part of her bristled, a tenderness startled by the memory of his cool counsel, but another part, the part that had learned to make balm out of brambles, breathed. To be taught by someone who demanded clarity could be a wound if he wanted it so, or a sharpening if he allowed it. She looked up. The older woman recognized the weather in her eyes and came to stand beside her without instruction. Gabriel's voice was quiet and steady when it arrived. "He knows your power now," he said. "He saw what you are when no one is feeding you applause. He will either honor that or prove himself small." "You know how to walk through both." "I don't want to fight," she said. "You don't have to," the older woman answered. "Just don't fold. There's a difference." The first week at the conservatory unfurled like a sheet lifted and laid across a bed. Brisk, total, smoothing itself over corners she had not known needed covering. Classes began early and ran long. Practice rooms were booked in shifts, tight as lace. She learned the hallways by sound more than sight. The thin, persistent call of a violin searching for its upper register, the dignified complaint of a bass, the avian chatter of flutes in a nest of difficult passages. The piano rooms smelled of polish and patience. She chose one and began to build a belonging inside it with the same steady tenderness she had used to build belonging in the older woman's house. Sterling met her officially on a Wednesday afternoon, his office lined with scores arranged in a grid like a city. Everything neat, nothing easy. Light fell across his desk in a golden sheet. He gestured to a chair, and she sat, her back straight, not out of deference but out of honesty. She did not want to appear diminished in a place meant for standing tall. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that gaze she felt both evaluation and curiosity. 2 threads twisted into a cord that could pull a student forward or choke her if handled with haste. "Miss Chen," he said, and the name did not cut this time. It simply landed. "Congratulations. Your audition compelled the room. That is rare." "Thank you," she said, and meant it. He nodded once. Compelling is not yet consistent. My job is to give you spine where you are already light, and breath where you are already stone. He watched her face as if he could hear her breath arranging itself inside her ribs. I will ask much. I will give more. Are you willing? The word yes lived in her mouth like a seed ready to crack open. I am. He did not smile exactly, but the room loosened like a fist that has decided not to close. He handed her a score and then another. He questioned her about fingering, phrasing, how she understands rubato as truth and not indulgence. She answered plainly, not to impress, only to speak the language she had learned from hunger and home. When she left, her chest was full, not with dread, but with the clean ache of a door that requires the body to square itself before passing through. Evenings belonged to the house that had taught her how to be whole again. There, healing lived in the ordinary. The older woman's insistence on a bowl of fruit left where hands could reach without thought, a blanket smoothed over the back of the couch, the particular way lamps kneel their light over a page. Gabriel arrived like weather one can count on, early, warm, occasionally carrying a gust of mischief. They did not always play. Sometimes he sat on the floor and tuned by the window while she practiced. Sometimes she watched him move the bow across an open string until the room was nothing but a single growing line of sound. On Fridays they walked to the river, and the city passed them as if on purpose, leaving them alone inside the moving world. Not everything lifted easily. There are surfaces that look like glass and reveal themselves as ice. A rumor travelled, quiet, precise, the way cold air finds a crack, up a stairwell, along a corridor, into a practice room, that Sterling had fought against her, that Gabriel, once a conservatory golden boy, had argued on her behalf, that favoritism now dragged behind her like a mistuned drum. She felt it as one feels a draught rather than a door, a presence just cold enough to stiffen the muscles of the neck. She put her palms flat on the piano and let her breath count the bars. It is not your job, she told her hands, to answer whispers. Your job is to tell the truth loudly enough that whispers tire. Still, a heart is tender even when it is strong. She found herself quieter at dinner, the soup too hot on her tongue, the bread a little less sweet. The older woman watched her for a while and then placed a jar of salt on the table as if it were a talisman. We season to taste, she said, and the sentence meant more than dinner. If the world is bland, we add. If it is too sharp, we soften. If it is bitter, we remember honey exists. Gabriel took a breath, as if to say something, and did not. Later, when the dishes had dried and the piano had been closed softly as a book, he found her on the porch steps. Night lay itself across the city like a shawl. The garden made the kind of dark scents that remind the body it was made to be soothed. You don't have to hold that alone, he said. I know, she answered. But sometimes the first holding is private. He sat 2 steps below and to the side, respectful of her solitude, but close enough to catch any thought that might fall. When I was a student, he said after a while, they called me gentle as an insult. They meant I would break. They did not know that gentleness is a material stronger than steel if you live long enough to learn it. She turned her head and watched his profile as one looks at a landscape. You didn't break. He shook his head, smiling a little. I learned to bend with a rhythm that wasn't theirs. He glanced up at her, not seeking argument, only offering. You're teaching me again." They carried the week like a bowl passed between careful hands. On Saturday morning, the older woman declared a Sabbath of small delights. "No scales before noon," she said. "No studies before cake." They walked to the market and came home with strawberries that stained their fingers and tiny purple flowers the vendor called heliotrope, which smelled like a childhood she had not lived but somehow remembered. She practiced then, but differently, less as a ladder and more as a meadow, wandering through pieces she loved, letting the piano be the friend it had always been before it became a taskmaster. In the afternoon she opened her notebook and wrote, not music yet, but lines like stepping stones: river, window, lantern, hand. The words made a path to something. Later they would become a piece that began as breath and ended as the sound of two notes learning to listen. For now they were just words that felt like water in a cup. Sunday brought the circle of older musicians again, their coats smelling of wool and clean rain, their laughter full-bodied and unafraid. They listened with their eyes closed, some with their palms turned up as if to catch what fell. They did not pretend every phrase was perfect. They asked that she deepen this, cradle that, hold a silence longer at the end of a line, because tenderness takes a moment to realize it has been invited. After, a woman with a silver ring on each finger put her hands around the girl's wrists and blessed them, not with words, but with a warmth that felt like music made skin. It would have been lovely if the weeks had simply repeated themselves like a refrain. But refrains, to earn their return, need verses that test them. One afternoon, as summer leaned toward its own ripeness, a message arrived at the conservatory that rearranged the room. Her mother had been found, a social worker, careful voice, patient tone, alive in a nearby shelter, sober for 3 weeks, ready to ask for help she had not yet learned how to receive. She stood in the hallway and read the message twice, then a third time, as if it might unwind and reveal a second, hidden letter behind it. The floor shifted, not dangerously, but like a boat meeting a wave. She found the older woman first, because hers was the embrace that could hold both joy and grief without correcting either. They sat together in the kitchen with the letter on the table, letting tea do its slow, sensible work. "Do you want me to come?" the older woman asked, and the question was not a string, but a bridge. "Yes," she said, and then, after a breath, "And Gabriel." They took the car, though the shelter was walking distance, because arriving in a small vessel of safety felt right. Outside, a boy drew chalk stars on the sidewalk and offered them the stub of blue for luck. Inside, a woman at a desk with careful eyes led them to a room with chairs arranged in a semicircle, as if expecting a choir. Her mother sat at the far end, hands folded like a child called to the front of the class, hair clean and gathered back from a face that had remembered its bones. When she stood, her body made a sound, a tiny intake of breath that reminded the girl of nights long ago when she had pretended sleep and listened for the piano in the other room. They did not run to each other. There are reunions for that. This was not one. They walked like people carrying something fragile and heavy, meeting in the center of a small square of vinyl floor. Her mother's hands trembled and then settled, found her daughters, pressed them, released them, took them again. The apology that came was not theatrical. It was quiet and round, like a stone warmed in the sun. It did not ask to be absolved, only to be heard. "I'm here," the girl said, and it was both forgiveness and fact. The older woman stood nearby as if guarding a doorway. her presence an architectural kindness. Gabriel lingered by the corridor, his eyes on the window in case the sky offered a sign that everything would be all right, though he knew the sky, like people, rarely announces guarantees. He looked at them with a tenderness that asked nothing. They talked about small things, because small things are the muscles of love. Food, sleep, the way the vending machine still ate coins like a greedy bird. The mother's voice gathered strength, as if remembering it could carry something without dropping it. She asked about the piano and the house and the auditions, and then she asked about the father, which is to say, she asked about all of them, the living and the dead. The girl told her what she could without pressing the past into a shape it did not want to take. After, they walked back to the car as if leaving a clinic, having received a medicine whose side effects were not yet known. The girl held the blue chalk star in her hand and let it draw a faint line along the inside of her wrist. At home, the house made space for the new shape of the world. The older woman put a second kettle on. Gabriel tuned a low C until it sounded like a bell through fog. The girl sat at the piano and placed her fingers on a chord she had never tried. It sounded like threshold, like healing without proclamation, like a door opening to a room that would require them to learn how to be gentle in a new way. Night deepened. She went to her room and lay on the bed, not to escape, but to arrange herself around what had changed. The worn bag with her father's pages was on the chair. Her own notebook was on the table. The letter from the conservatory, with its yes, was tucked into the mirror's frame as if to bless her reflection. She thought of Sterling's careful gaze, of the whisper in the hall that had tried to be a wind and had settled for being a draught, of Gabriel's hands steadying the bow, of the older woman's quiet defiance in serving cake before soup. She thought of her mother's hands and how they had remembered her daughter's shape. A soft knock. She sat up. Gabriel stepped into the doorway, the hall light making a thin halo around him. He didn't enter. He leaned against the frame and let the quiet find its level. "I keep thinking about a thing my teacher once said," he murmured, "that music is a house with many rooms. Some are bright and filled with people. Some are small and ask you to whisper. Some are locked until you learn how to carry the key." He paused, the pause itself kind. "If you want, we can learn the keys together." Something unclenched in her chest, not dramatically, but decisively. "I want that," she said, and felt the truth settle into the room like a candle that does not flicker. He nodded, and the nod carried a promise folded inside it. "Sleep," he said softly. "Tomorrow we'll put flowers on the piano and teach the house a new song." She slept, and the sleep was a lake that held her without asking questions. Morning came in on slow feet, and with it the ordinary sacraments, the kettle's hymn, the garden's gossip, the older woman's gentle order. They placed a small vase on the piano and tucked 3 heliotrope blooms inside. Their scent threaded the air, a quiet thread of sweetness. She sat at the bench. Gabriel tuned. The older woman settled with a book she would not read. The house listened. The first notes rose like a bird that had learned not only how to fly, but how to land without fear. The melody was new, but it carried the recognizable weight of the life they were making. Study and laughter, letters and rooms, river walks and porch steps, rumor and refusal to bow to rumor, a mother learning the grammar of return, a teacher learning the grammar of grace, a friend becoming beloved with the patience of tide. The music did its gentle work, winding through the ribs, smoothing the edges, lighting the corners no one else knows. When they finished, no one clapped. The air didn't require it. They let the quiet be a halo and moved on with the day. Forms to fill, meals to plan, a visit to arrange, a piece to polish for a room of strangers whose ears would perhaps learn their own names when her hands spoke. She stepped away from the bench with the lightness of someone who has discovered that joy is not a peak, but a practice. Outside, the sky gathered a promise of rain. Inside, the house gathered its people. Stirling's schedule awaited with its pointed kindness. The conservatory's corridors would buzz, rumours would arrive and leave like weather, but the steady hum at the centre held. In that hum were three truths she carried like talismans. Tenderness is not weakness. Clarity is a form of love. Music, when it is honest, is a kind of healing that makes room for everything without asking anything to shrink. She pressed her palm to the piano once more and felt the faint vibration answer her hand. A living thing, returning touch with touch. Then she turned toward the door where the world waited like a page clear and wide enough to write on. And as she stepped through into the day, she felt, without needing to test it, the warmth of two presences at her back. A woman who had made a home out of steadfastness, and a man whose bow could draw a line straight through doubt and leave, in its wake, a shine that made even the hardest rooms feel a little more like light. Autumn leaned gently into the city, turning the edges of leaves to brass. She began to measure time by the soft rituals that kept her steady, the kettle's small song each morning, the heliotrope's faint perfume as it faded and returned, the echo of her footsteps in the conservatory's long corridor where her reflection passed and repassed in the glass. The work deepened. Stirling's critiques came like precise weather, sometimes a dry wind that stripped away indulgence, sometimes a quiet mist that asked her to listen closer than comfort allowed. He never raised his voice. He did not need to. His questions opened rooms she hadn't known were there. "Where does this phrase breathe?" he would ask, pencil poised. "What is your left hand refusing to confess?" He did not tolerate sentimentality masquerading as sincerity, yet when she answered with the clean truth of how hunger had taught her rubato, how grief had taught her to lean and release, he nodded as if a bell beneath the floor had rung, not loudly, but undeniably. The rumour-soft cold lingered in certain corners, but it no longer owned her posture. She moved through it like someone carrying a lantern through fog, careful, unafraid. Gabriel's presence became its own ordinary holiness. He appeared at the end of days with a bag of figs or a ridiculous joke, the kind that unknotted a forehead. He learned without asking the weeks when silence suited her best, when talking would only scatter what she needed to gather. He matched her quiet with his own, companioning her through stretches of practice where words were more burden than balm. And still, sometimes, laughter startled the house the way a flock of birds startles a pond, sudden, bright, then settling back into mirrored calm. Her mother kept her appointments. The shelter became a halfway place, neither home nor exile, a vestibule with chairs along the walls, and a bulletin board of fragile hopes. Twice a week they sat together on the porch steps after dinner. The older woman would pass them mugs that steamed in the cool air and then disappear into the kitchen where dishes made the kind of small voices that make a house feel saved. They did not litigate the past. They admired the stubborn roses and the moon's humble work. Once her mother asked to hear the piece, her letter, and when the last note faded, she pressed both hands to her mouth and cried the tears a body saves for a day when it has permission to be held. The girl did not rush. She let silence make a cradle, then placed her mother's head against her shoulder and breathed with her until their griefs found the same rhythm and did not frighten either of them any more. The conservatory announced a winter concert, a night of faculty-mentored performances, proceeds to fund scholarships and community programs. Sterling's name appeared bold on the program. Beneath it, hers. Another line promised a collaborative piece with strings, a new arrangement to be unveiled. The announcement rippled through the student body like a thrown stone. Some congratulations rang true. Others landed with the soft thud of skepticism wrapped in praise. She accepted them all with a steady kindness that owed nothing to vanity and everything to her decision not to reduce herself to anyone else's story of her. They rehearsed evenings in the small recital room that smelled faintly of cedar and lilac floor polish, a scent the older woman swore was left over from some long-ago administrator who had believed that fragrance could discipline chaos. Gabriel's cello met her phrases the way a shoreline meets waves, receiving, defining, returning. They shaped an arrangement of a simple hymn-like tune she had found scribbled in her father's margin notes, a melody he had used to coax her from fear to laughter when she was small. Now she set it in a minor key and then back into major, letting it travel the way a person travels through a year and still finds home at the end. Sterling attended one of the last rehearsals, sitting 2 rows back with his hands folded so they would not betray their opinion before he was ready to speak it. When they finished, the room held a sweetness that had not been there when they began. He rose, came closer, and rested 2 fingers on the edge of the piano as if testing its temperature. "You discovered restraint," he said, softer than usual. "Do not lose it in the hall." He looked at Gabriel the way one musician looks at another across a battlefield that has become a garden. "Your line dignifies hers." It was not flattery. It was a talk of acceptance settling into place. The last week before the concert tightened like a bow. Study dovetailed with kindness. The older woman insisted on late suppers and naps. "We do not let brilliance starve," she said, setting a dish of stewed apples on the table as if it were a sacrament. She pressed a small talisman into the girl's palm, a brass button that had fallen long ago from a dress the older woman had loved to ruin, she explained, by dancing in kitchens. "For your pocket," she said, "so you remember that joy is not an accident, it's maintenance." If jealousy had a final attempt to make, it did so 2 days before the performance, in the form of a clipped note slid beneath a practice room door. Not words, but a cruel, anonymous caricature penciled in swift strokes. A girl at a piano with a bowl at her feet. It was not skillful. It did not need to be. She found it, studied it for the precise measure of a heartbeat, felt the old ache move in her like weather remembered, then folded the paper twice and fed it gently to the metal mouth of a trash can. When she returned to the keys, her hands were not harder. They were truer. A janitor who had been mopping in the corridor paused in the doorway and tipped his head, an almost bow that contained more dignity than a dozen speeches. She bowed back, a secret exchange that pinned her to the good. The night of the concert arrived without pageantry. Snow threatened and then changed its mind. The hall filled Faculty in their best attentiveness, students with collars askew and eyes promissory, donors perfumed with the future they believed they were buying, and the ordinary city too, the baker who always pinched the corners of the bread just before sliding it into the oven, the bus driver who waved when she crossed the street, the violinist who had shared a practice room and her last granola bar at the same time. Her mother sat near the front, flanked by two shelter friends who radiated a fierce, protective pride. The older woman wore a brooch in the shape of a treble clef she claimed was vulgar and therefore perfect. It caught the light every time she laughed. Backstage, she pressed her fingers into the small pockets of her dress until she felt the smooth curve of the brass button. She found Gabriel's eyes. No speech. The nod they exchanged was an oath. I will meet you where I promised to be. Sterling stood near the wing, reading the program as if he hadn't chosen its order, then set the papers aside and leaned a shoulder against the wall, like a man letting himself be other than rigid for a time. Her solo came midway. She walked into the light, bowed gratitude, and sat. The grand was generous and strange, the way all new instruments are for a breath before they become a river. She placed her hands and, before beginning, held one small pause, not for drama, but for alignment. When sound finally happened, it came as if it had been waiting behind the curtain of the room and had only needed permission. She did not speak her sorrow in a tongue the hall could translate into pity. She spoke her joy in a syntax that asked the audience to recall their own. The middle section, which in practice had threatened to gallop off without her, consented to be led at a human pace. The ending did not stoop for applause. It rose and took the ceiling with it. Silence. Then a sound like weather breaking. She did not meet Sterling's gaze on her way to the wing. She chose the older woman's instead, that bright, steady harbour. Then she and Gabriel took their places for the duet. He stood, she sat. The lights warmed to something like kitchen lamp gold. The first note was his, a low thread that tied the room to the floor so the rest could lift. She answered with a line simple as breath. They moved toward the modulation together, and, at the turn, she felt the world tilt and find a truer horizon. In the row where her mother sat, a hand reached for another hand. In the back, a student who had decided that morning to quit the cello waited one more day. In the quiet, after the final chord, there was a small surprise. Sterling's hands, first to meet, fingers flat, then curved, the clap full in the palm. He didn't stand yet. He would stand later, for other reasons, and in private. For now, this was enough. The clean circle of sound, the acknowledgement that deference had nothing to do with the recognition of light. The reception tried to arrange itself around trays and conversations at angles. She let the compliments pass through her without snagging, like rain through leaves. A woman with salt-white hair from the community centre asked if she taught and if she would come. "We have a keyboard missing 2 black keys," the woman said, "and a boy who doesn't care." The girl smiled, already remembering the number of the bus, the direction of the wind by that building, the exact way to carry a keyboard so a boy might decide to care. She said yes before anyone could explain a calendar's objections. She found her mother by the punch bowl, which someone had spiked with generosity. The older woman stood nearby, fielding a donor's story about an aunt who had once played the harp with fingers like bird bones. Gabriel arrived with a plate of things that glittered and did not taste like anything but sugar. Her mother touched her cheek lightly, as if adjusting an old portrait. "You looked like yourself," she said. "There is no finer praise." It might have ended there, on that bright note, in that safe room. But life, which despises tidy bows, set another measure on the stand. A staff member slipped into the reception, moving at the speed of courtesy, but carrying urgency under his coat. He asked for her, then for Gabriel. The community centre had called. A pipe had burst. The piano room was flooding. The boy who didn't care had called because he did. Could someone come? They left coats unbuttoned and stepped into a night that had remembered how to snow. At the centre, the smell of wet drywall and tin was everywhere. Water fell from a seam in the ceiling like a cheap curtain in a school play. Volunteers scrambled with mops, buckets, laughter used like rope. In the piano room, the old upright stood with its feet in an inch of water, stubborn, brave. The boy, skinny, angry, tender, held the plug for a power strip above his head with both hands, muscles trembling as if he could keep electricity from touching water by sheer will. She took the strip from him, killed the power, and set it high on a desk. "You called," she said. He shrugged. "Didn't want it to die," he muttered, not looking at the instrument, which was to say he loved it. They set to work. They slid the piano onto bricks, ripped rugs up, squeegeed water toward the door, as if it had committed a crime and needed to leave. Sterling arrived 20 minutes later, breath caught but eyes clear, a wool scarf scolding his throat. He didn't hesitate. He knelt in the mess like a student and began to pass soaked books into a dry corner. "Pages dry better when fanned," he said to no one, and fanned them with the calm of a man who had done this before, somewhere no one knew about. By midnight, the room was a damp, shining testimony. The pipe was capped. The floor had stopped pretending to be a lake. The upright had been coaxed into a towel skirt. Someone started a kettle on a hot plate, while a volunteer improvised a ceremony of mugs. The boy sat cross-legged near the piano, shivering with relief now that there was room for it. She sat beside him, close enough for warmth, far enough for dignity, and together they listened to the soft, brave sound of a building, remembering how to be a building. Sterling stood in the doorway and caught her eye. It was not triumph and not apology that passed between them. It was a recognition that the work they were doing, on a stage, in a room like this, in a kitchen, was all one work. He lifted 2 fingers from his mug in a salute too small for anyone else to notice. Gabriel, who had stayed ridiculous and useful in equal measure all night, handed the boy his coat. "It will fit you soon," he said. "Grow into it." They walked home in the hour when the snow considers whether to keep covering the earth. Her mother was awake on the couch, a blanket over her knees, the older woman beside her with a deck of cards unsorted, the room smelling of broth that had been reheated 2 times and somehow tasted better for the repetition. Her mother looked at their wet cuffs, their damp hair, their faces pink from cold and work. "You saved a piano," she said, as if this were the only measure of a life that mattered. "We saved a room," the girl corrected, and felt it as a truth she could live inside for a long time. The days after settled into a new pattern. Morning practice, afternoon classes, evening visits to the centre. The boy arrived each time before she did and left after, as if guarding the instrument required him to stand between it and the door. She taught him scales and left-hand patterns, which he dismissed as chores until, accidentally, he found himself making music. His laughter, when it came without his permission, rearranged the molecules of the room. Other children emerged from corners and doorways, drawn by sound. She showed them how to listen to one note until it revealed its shape. She taught them that wrong notes are invitations, not indictments. There was no curriculum unless you count tenderness as a syllabus. Rumor, which hates direct evidence, moved on. Sterling began to ask about the center, as if community were part of technique. He suggested repertoire that translated well to keyboards missing 2 black keys and sent an email to a donor whose heart had been waiting for a place to land. Gabriel organized a small concert in the room that had nearly drowned. The older woman baked 3 pies and pretended to scowl at the crumbs on the sheet music. Her mother, on a plastic chair near the door, held a paper cup of lemonade and told anyone who would listen that her daughter played as if she remembered being saved by the very instrument beneath her hands. Winter did what it always does, covered and revealed by turn. The conservatory hallways grew full of coats and whispers, of rehearsals ripped raw by deadlines and then stitched back by resolve. She learned to shoulder a backpack and a bundle of sheet music and a bag of apples at once. On certain exhausted nights, she found herself drifting toward doubt again, not because anything had failed, but because the body sometimes forgets what the soul has promised. When that happened, she sat in the music room after lights out and played not scales, not repertoire, but the unadorned notes of a lullaby her father had taught her. She let the house remind her that healing is a loop, not a line. One evening, late, the music room dark except for a low lamp, she finished the lullaby and found Gabriel at the threshold, listening with his whole face. He didn't enter right away. He leaned one shoulder against the frame the way Sterling had once done, the way men do when they are practicing being gentle. When he did cross to her, he did it as if crossing a border he'd been invited to acknowledge. He set his bow on the closed fallboard, a quiet declaration of truce with the day. "You look tired," he said, which is a way of saying, "I see you." "I am," she answered, which is a way of saying, "I will let myself be seen." He took her hands between his, not to own them, but to warm them. The room altered, the way rooms do when truth steps in and stands where fear used to stand. "There are promises I can't make," he said, his voice nearly a whisper. "I can't promise easy or even fair. But I can promise to stand at the edge of your music and keep the world from rushing you. I can promise to be quiet when quiet is the medicine, and to be loud when loud is the bridge." He smiled then, a small thing, a candle. "I can promise to carry rosin and spare strings and a joke that ruins itself because it cannot wait to be told." Her laugh came out raw and perfect. She didn't answer with words. She rested her forehead against his and let their breathing learn a shared meter. Nothing theatrical, no thunderclap, just 2 people setting their metronomes to the same time. When they parted, it was not away, but toward, the kind of parting that makes room. She packed her pages, he his bow, and they walked back through the sleeping house to where the older woman had, of course, left the porch light on. Her mother's window was dark. The heliotrope on the piano had given up its last breath of sweetness and would need replacing in the morning. She touched the brass button in her pocket and felt the smooth, worn face of an object made to hold fabric together. It did its work again, invisibly. In the days to come, letters would arrive about funding for the center. Sterling would bring a stack of scores with fingerings written in his hand that made difficult passages bloom. Her mother would move into a place with a window that faced east so the sun could practice on her face each morning. The boy would play a piece with both hands and forget to be angry for an entire minute and a half. The city would thaw, the roses would form their quiet fists. But on this night, before all of that, she stood at the threshold of the music room and looked back. The piano reflected a small version of her face in its polished lid, and beside that reflection, tilted toward hers as if always meant to be there, another face. Not a mirror image, but a harmony. She turned out the light with the easy gratitude of someone who knows the dark is not a threat but a blanket, pulled the door gently closed, and carried the hum of their shared vow down the hall toward sleep, which came not as a cliff to fall from, but as a shore to arrive at, warm, healing, and wide enough for two. Spring announced itself in the city with a quiet insistence, coaxing branches into blossom, letting rain soften the hard edges of stone. She had been at the conservatory long enough now that its corridors felt less like a labyrinth and more like a second home, though still one that asked her daily to be brave. Each morning she carried herself into practice rooms that smelled of resin and varnish, where walls remembered centuries of scales and tears. Her fingers, once raw from hunger and cold, now grew strong again, moving with a fluency her father would have recognized. And still she carried humility in every note, because she knew music was not conquered, it was courted tenderly, endlessly. The community center where the old piano had nearly drowned became her second sanctuary. Children flocked there now, some curious, some shy, some pretending not to care, until a chord unlocked something inside them. She knelt beside them, showing how to find middle C, how to make one hand wait while the other told its story, how a mistake was not a disaster, but a doorway. Healing lived in those afternoons, healing for the children, for her mother, who sometimes came and sat in the back, knitting uneven rows, her face serene in ways the girl had not seen since childhood. The boy who once held a power strip above water played with both hands now, and when he finished, he grinned without permission, a grin that filled the room like sunlight spilling through cracked blinds. Gabriel was there most evenings, his cello case leaning against the wall, his bow teaching the children to listen, to breathe. He worked with the older ones, his patience deep as earth, his laughter unspooling like thread across the crowded room. Together they taught more than scales. They taught presence, the art of showing up with honesty. Sometimes they played duets in front of the children, short, simple pieces that made the little ones fall silent with wonder. One girl whispered afterward, "It sounds like you're talking without words." And they smiled because the child had heard the truth. Sterling, too, surprised them. He came one afternoon, his shoes splashed by a rain he hadn't avoided, his coat folded over one arm. He stood at the back with his hands clasped, listening as children pounded and fumbled their way through scales. He did not correct. He did not critique. Later, he asked her quietly what it would take to repair the missing black keys. When she told him, he nodded once, and a week later a carpenter arrived with a case of tools and a reverence for wood. Sterling's sternness never left him. But in his presence now was a layer of respect. It was not indulgence, it was something cleaner, an acknowledgement that discipline could serve love instead of replacing it. Her mother moved into a small apartment with east-facing windows. The first morning light filled the room, painting her face with gold. Sometimes she walked to the center to watch. Sometimes she joined them at the house, knitting by the fire, while Gabriel tuned or the older woman told stories of her youth, stories that made them all laugh until their stomachs hurt. The girl would sit at the piano, listening to their voices, and feel her heart expand. Healing was not a sudden miracle. It was this, a thread of ordinary kindness, woven day by day until it became strong enough to hold. The conservatory prepared for its gala, a performance in the grand hall before donors, critics, the city's finest. She had been chosen as a featured soloist, a recognition she once would have thought impossible. When the night arrived, she wore a dress the older woman had helped her choose, black as ink, flowing like river water. Her hair was gathered simply, a single silver pin glinting like a star. Gabriel walked with her to the stage doors, his bow in hand, his eyes a steadying anchor. Sterling gave her one nod, precise and formal, but his gaze softened as she passed, as though he had finally understood that she did not play for approval, she played for truth. She stepped onto the stage, and the hall hushed. Lights warmed her skin. The piano waited, gleaming under the gaze of hundreds. She bowed, sat, breathed. And when her fingers touched the keys, she let everything pour forth, the hunger and the hope, the nights under bridges, the applause that had changed her life, the lessons in kitchens, the laughter of children, the steady devotion of Gabriel, the fierce love of the older woman, the return of her mother. Every note became a story, every phrase a thread of healing stretched across the hall. Listeners leaned forward, their hearts caught in the tide. She finished with her own piece, Letter to My Father, played now not with grief alone, but with peace. And when the final chord dissolved into silence, the hall erupted, not just applause, but a standing ovation that thundered like rain on a roof after drought. She stood, bowed, and saw faces lit with tears and joy. In the front row, her mother's hands were clasped in prayer. The older woman's brooch glittered like a promise kept. Gabriel's eyes found hers, steady, luminous, carrying an unspoken vow. Even Sterling, reluctant as stone, was on his feet, his applause deliberate, his mouth softened by something that might have been pride. She felt the moment lodge inside her, not as triumph, but as belonging. She no longer had to ask for food or permission. She had found her place, and it was here. Inside music, inside love, inside healing, that touched not only herself, but everyone who heard her play. That night, after the gala, she returned to the house. The others had gone to bed, but she slipped into the music room. The heliotrope on the piano had wilted, but its fragrance lingered faintly. She placed her hand on the keys and whispered a thank you to her father, to her journey, to the music itself. Then she played softly, not for applause, not for recognition, but as a prayer of gratitude. And in the quiet, she understood. Her story was not just survival, not just success. It was a reminder that even from hunger, beauty can rise. From loneliness, love can bloom. From brokenness, healing can flow. Her fingers lingered on the last note, letting it glow like a lantern in the dark. Then she looked up, smiled to herself, and thought of all those who had listened, who had believed, who had walked with her in silence and sound alike. The world was wide, her journey still unfolding, but her heart was steady. If her story has touched something inside you, if the music of these words has given you comfort, healing, or hope, leave a comment and let your voice join this song. Like, subscribe, and share, so that this melody of love and resilience may reach even more hearts. Your presence here is part of the music, and together we keep the song alive.